All right, folks. Good afternoon. It is Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. Today is a very, very awesome show for me. Obviously, we at Real Progressives spend our time talking in heterodox economic circles. We've had Warren Mosler on the show many times. Warren is a friend of the program and a friend of mine, but we've never had the opportunity to have Professor Steve Keen join us before. Now, interestingly enough, there are some minor differences between the two camps and some interesting thoughts on what is called MCT and MMT. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring each one of them out and we're going to go ahead and have ourselves a conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to bring the guests on. Professor Keen, Warren, welcome to Real Progressives.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you.
So go ahead, Steve. With that, let's talk to you for a moment. Tell us about what your concerns are in terms of modern monetary theory and its relationship to the work you're doing. Because right now, obviously, there are some differences in between there, and it'd be good to flesh those out.
Okay. Well, it's a pity that Warren's not here to listen because, as I said in my comment on my Patreon blog, there are basically two areas where though I agree with the foundations of MMT, I think they don't take those foundations far enough, and in one sense, and they take them too far in the other. So the area they don't take them far enough in is that if you look at the analysis explaining how banks create money and how governments create money, then exactly the same logic applies to the international trade sector. So if you have if banks lending out more than they get back in repayments, they're creating money that way, but of course creating equivalent amount of debt, so no net equity for the private non-bank sector. If you have the government spending more than it gets back in taxation or takes back in taxation, then therefore you have government money creation. If you have exports exceeding imports, it's a convoluted process, but what actually involves in that is the exporter who is receiving money in a foreign currency. Let's use the UK and Europe rather than America to get away from the issues about the reserve currency. If a German exporter, the Germans net exporting to the UK, then the UK is buying German goods with British pounds, which several ways it can get there. But if you imagine a Mercedes-Benz being bought with a purchase of pounds in Britain, then those pounds get shipped to Germany, whether they're possessed by Mercedes-Benz. They tender that money to their private bank. Their private bank tenders those pounds to the central bank. The central bank then is obliged to credit the account of the Mercedes-Benz with euro. So what you get out of it, I think Warren's come back on his mobile phone here. What you get out of it is that the exports force the domestic, the surplus of exports over imports, force the central bank of the exporting surplus country to produce more of its domestic currency, where that's backed by the increase in the reserves it has of foreign currencies. And to me, that's a third way of creating money. Now, if you have a country,
explain that again?
Yeah. What I'm saying, this is where I think MMT doesn't take its own logic far enough, Warren. And that's to say that if you say that banks create money by lending more than they get back in repayments, then you have money creation, but of course, identically equivalent to increase in debt, so no net increase in equity for the private non-bank sector. The government, as we both know, the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, then it creates net equity and money for the private sector. If you have if you have an export surplus, then the same thing applies as to the government, because if your country is net exporting, then it is getting
let's stop for a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's say Germany is exporting to the United States, selling Volkswagens, and I pay for the Volkswagen with dollars. The Fed will indirectly debit my account and credit Volkswagen's account with dollars, right? At the bank, at the Volkswagen's member bank. Let's say it's Deutsche Bank.
Yeah.
So my bank, JP Morgan, gets debited. Deutsche Bank's reserve account gets credited with dollars. Okay. So then what happens? What's after that?
Well, then what happens if you went back
so
to
far,
that?
Just like any.
But if that account's in Germany, then those dollars are taken by
Wait a minute.
Mercedes-Benz.
The owner of the account can be in Germany, but the bank itself is in cyberspace, I guess, but it's a Fed member and has a reserve account at the Fed. So
you're still thinking of it. Let's drop the American example and take the UK, mate, because this is where I say
okay, let's go
MMT
to the
is
UK.
too American centric. If you have a British firm, British consumer buys a Mercedes-Benz with British pounds, which are given to the domestic wing of Mercedes-Benz in the UK. When the Mercedes-Benz then consolidates those profits globally, it transmits that money back to the pounds, back to Germany. Mercedes-Benz.
No, it counts for them, but the pounds stay at their bank in the UK until they spend the monies on something or sell it or transfer it. It doesn't go anywhere. It can only be in
come on. No, if you're a multinational, you want to consolidate back at your head office before you distribute the money. It's going to go back.
Yeah, you can consolidate for accounting purposes, but you have to have an account in pounds if that's how you got paid.
No, if you got paid in pounds, I'm buying and selling in pounds all the time because I'm buying it internationally all the time. And what is going on? My pounds, when they get received by, let's say, a software manufacturer in Italy, those pounds get converted to euros to benefit the account of the.
No. Somebody has to sell those pounds and buy euros. They don't get converted. They get sold and purchased.
Yeah, they get sold. That's fine. What I'm saying is, if I'm buying here.
So the pounds get sold. Let's do this one step at a time here. Let's get all the debits and credits in place. The pounds get sold to someone else, and that account in the UK gets transferred from that company who sold you the goods and the Italian company to somebody else who was selling, not lira, but euro and buying pounds. In the euro account, the names on the euro account switch and the names on the pound account switch, but the funds themselves don't move anywhere.
They have to move. Why else would an Italian software developer be selling stuff to me and accepting pounds in payment if he's not going to get euros in his bank account in Italy?
He gets euros, but he gets them from a euro account that's already there, that somebody has used to sell those euros and buy his pounds.
But what I'm saying is the increase in his account is motivated by the fact that he sold an export to me in Britain. Now,
absolutely.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. That is then causing money to be created in Italy.
No. No, in Italy, all that happened was euros
went in Italy.
What?
A deposit account goes up in Italy.
Yeah, but another one goes down. Whoever bought the pounds, their euro account, the guy who bought the pounds from them, his euro account goes down, and his pound account goes up.
If the money's tendered by the central bank, then the central bank is going to credit. Right.
No, the central bank doesn't do the federal. Go ahead.
Are you saying there's no money created by international trade surpluses?
Well, I don't know how we're defining money, but what I'm saying is the central banks do not convert currencies. Okay, that's all done in a marketplace. It's not conversion. If somebody buys a currency in exchange for another, you have exchanging.
Central banks have large reserves of foreign currency, do they not? Where do they get them?
Okay, some do. The U.S. does not. The European Central Bank has a residual hoard from, well, each country has it from before when they were individual countries. But to acquire those reserves, that central bank will go out in the market and sell its own currency to buy the foreign exchange reserves.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like, I cannot see how I cannot see, I'm working in terms of trying to mathematically model this in my stylized Minsky software.
Yeah.
And I cannot see how I can show, if I have one country which has had an surplus of exports over imports, I cannot not show that country uses that surplus of exports over imports to motivate the central bank to create more of its domestic currency. Because if I'm buying a sort of, paying 99, let me finish the sentence. If I'm paying €99 to buy a software package of somebody in Italy, at some point, 99 euros turns up in his account. Now, that I see as a 99 euro net increase in the amount of money in circulation in Italy, courtesy of that particular transaction. And when you aggregate at the global level, a country running a trade surplus like Germany has an enormous source of German mark creation coming out of the fact that it's running a 10% of GDP surplus.
Only to the extent that the government intervenes in the market, to the extent that the central bank, such as the Bundesbank under Marx, would sell marks and buy dollars to keep the mark from getting strong, then they are creating new marks, okay, that weren't there before in the private sector. But that's only a result of direct central bank intervention in the foreign exchange markets, which is not automatic. That's discretionary policy.
I know it's not automatic, but I'm saying it still is one of the potential sources of money creation. And if we're seeing
central bank intervention is what I call off-balance sheet deficit spending. But it's not done for the whole trade surplus. Look, Germany's got a large trade surplus, and the Bundesbank hasn't accumulated any dollars, and they haven't created any euros in the process. It's all done in a private sector. All the transactions were private sector. They never got to the
nonetheless, it's increasing the amount of money in the private sector.
What's that? No,
the
private sector, the euro. When Volkswagen sells dollars to buy euros, it does it with somebody else in the private sector whose euro account goes down.
It's selling Mercedes-Benz to buy pounds as well. That's my point. If you're producing and selling a surplus of your manufacturing,
let's walk it through. The Mercedes, let me walk it through. They sell the Mercedes to you, they get the pounds. They sell the pounds and buy euro with another private sector agent who had the euro. So his euro account goes down and Mercedes goes up. And that's why the euro's been going up. That's why the euro's been going up.
One of the reasons. The other, of course, is to undervalue the German currency dramatically with trade with the rest of the world and internally in Europe itself.
Yeah, but a trade surplus is a fundamental force that drives up a currency.
Yeah, agreed. And what I'm saying is that it's also a fundamental source that helps generate some of the domestic money, which is why Germany has both falling private debt and falling public debt, while an increasing money supply, because of that 10% trade surplus. And to me, that's a major source of the revenue that lets a country industrialize and manufacture and develop its manufacturing.
Tell us a little bit about what it is that you feel is the key difference in understand. It seems like a lot of people don't understand money creation in general. And obviously you and Warren, two people that have spent enormous amounts of time researching this and living this, have even a different understanding of the money creation process. I mean, these clerics in the high towers have made a good job of making it confusing for regular people, much less folks that spend forever studying it. I mean, why do you suppose that is? Is this just about, keeping it as complex as possible to ensure that the proletariat doesn't know what's going on?
No, I think what you've got is a fundamentally religious belief about the nature of capitalism, which was, you can really read right back to Jean-Baptiste Say, back at the time of Ricardo, arguing that capitalism is an inherently utility maximizing full employment system, and as an essential part of that, Say abstracted from the existence of money. If you actually read what he called the Catechism of Political Economy, he said we do not, people who sell are really demanding merchandise for their merchandise. Money plays no substantial role. And when you look at the neoclassical theory that really is a mathematical elaboration of Say's fantasies, what that includes is the neutrality of money. Now, if you say money is not neutral, which is a major part of what MMT is talking about, then you pull the tiny piece of neoclassical edifice out. And it's such an intricate belief system that any particular part falling apart cause the entire thing to shatter. So they fight to hang on to that belief. And my favorite example of that right now is a paper by a couple of Swiss neoclassicals, a guy called Thor and Gerbach, I think, where they try to show that loanable funds and endogenous money are identical so long as you assume there's no risk, therefore no uncertainty, and therefore no bank defaults. Now, if you're willing to assume that, I can assume you'd like to buy a bridge off me. It's just insanely bad, but that's that they are retreating from the real world, and the major part of that retreat is not allowing the reality of money in. And what MMT is saying is that we have to understand the reality of money to understand a capitalist system. Capitalism is fundamentally monetary. So I think that's the strong point. That's the major reason that I overlap so much with MMT. My points where I don't overlap are twofold. One is that I think They haven't properly incorporated the role of the international sector. I'm going to continue disagreeing with Ron. We're not going to reach a resolution in this discussion, obviously, on that particular point. But another part of it comes, we might actually talk more about this in a moment, is the tendency among some MMT authors to argue that unemployment is caused by the government. On the basis that if you didn't have the government taxing too much, there'd be full employment. And I think that is a very, very fallacious and very dangerous way of expressing a wrong idea.
All right,
okay,
Warren's back, and what we wanted to do, Steve Keen just brought up the idea that his disagreement, one of the key disagreements, is the role of government in causing unemployment, et cetera. Okay. I should probably let Steve recap that so I don't put words in his mouth.
Hey, Steve, let me just wrap up the last one.
Sure.
Whenever the state or the government buys something and doesn't tax, that's deficit spending. That's a net add to the economy, and so of net financial assets. And so when the European Central Bank, if they were to buy dollars, that would, and pay with euro, that would be a net add of euro net financial assets, but they don't. Now, Bank of China does. It's optional government policy. Germany used to do it. I think they had $50 billion before they joined the euro that they got from selling marks to buying euros. So trade per se doesn't change foreign exchange reserves. It doesn't change the net financial assets, the global net financial assets of that currency. It just transfers them from one owner to another. It transfers them from a non-resident to a resident, or from a resident to a non-resident.
But that's transfer from non-resident to resident. It's increasing money where the residents are, which is my point.
Well, the money, again, the money stays in the same place. It's just the owner of the account changes hands. I'm not saying it doesn't have consequences. I'm not saying it doesn't have consequences.
Yeah, but
from a monetary, but from a monetary perspective, the account goes from Joe at Citibank, the dollar, and if you're like, again, in UK buying a Mercedes from Germany, the pounds go from your account to Mercedes, and then they go from Mercedes account to whoever sells them the euro. And the euros goes from whoever sold them the euro to Mercedes on some bank, on the books of some European bank. So you have,
but I'm still seeing
the euro account changes hands in Germany, and the pound account changes hands in the UK.
Yeah, but what I'm seeing happening is the euro account of Mercedes increases as a result of that, and they can finance their investment with their trade surplus.
But the account of but the account of somebody in Germany, euro account went down. The total euro doesn't change. It just transfers from one account to another. There's no net creation of euro.
I would disagree. I think, again, I need to model this out, but I disagree. I think in that particular case, you would have the central bank being motivated to create more euros than it would do if it wasn't a trade surplus.
Well, look, there's a big surplus now. Europe is running a $300 billion a year surplus. And the ECB hasn't, sold a single euro or bought a single dollar. They've just let it go.
Yeah, but if you look at what's happening in Germany, and this is again the data I look at all the time, the declining level of both government and private debt there in Germany.
Yeah.
The way to explain that while Germany is still growing is that it's growing courtesy of its trade surplus.
Yeah, exactly. I agree, but it's because euros are being transferred from another private sector holder to German private sector holders.
Yeah, well, that's my point. And that's creating money in that process. And it's I
don't know if you.
That's why I don't see exports as you. Well, you have to give your comment you've made in your points that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. Let's talk about that one.
Yeah. So we're talking. It's in real terms, not in nominal terms. In real terms, look at the extreme. Let's say you export everything and don't import anything. What happens? I mean, everybody dies. You have no food. You have nothing.
I can give you the same extreme in the other direction. And if everybody tries to import and nobody exports, nobody produces rather.
No, everybody in your country, just your country. So what if your country imports everything and doesn't have to export anything? You've got all the golf clubs, the tennis rackets. You're out having the food. You're out having a good time. Okay, it's always.
I see a lot of bored people in America voting for Trump. It's precisely that situation. And that's a major hole in the MMT argument.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's psychologically. I'm just saying in real economic terms, Look, if you win the war, the other guy sends stuff to you. You don't send stuff to him. You know,
and that gives us that's what gave us the Second World War. You know, in terms of the reparation with the Germany, were not exactly a productive outcome for the world. When that's exactly what the French wanted to do.
I didn't say they were. I'm saying the exports are the burden. It's the real cost to your economy. You build stuff and give it to somebody else. And imports, somebody else builds stuff and sends it to you. Now, you know, that's the statement about imports being real benefits and exports.
I still think that's too superficial. I think it's too glib. Because
may I interrupt momentarily? I have a question.
Let me just ask Steve. Steve, real terms of trade, you know, you try and get the most for the least, right?
You do. And
okay,
you try
why?
At the same time, if you're producing, you try to get the best terms you can for what you're selling. True. But at the same time, you want to be manufacturing and growing. And if you are just simply, America can get away with what you're talking about, Warren, indefinitely, because it produces the international reserve currency. You put yourself in a situation of a country like the UK, which is doing that, or Australia is doing it. The only way they can balance their current account by having a continuous deficit on the current account is a continuous surplus on the capital account, which means they're selling their assets to overseas owners.
Steve,
and over time,
I'm not saying
that is a bigger loss than exports.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're not, but number one, when you know somebody buys an apartment in London, they don't dig it up and take it home. Okay, and number two, look at India. I mean, India's been running a current account deficit and trade deficit for what, 25 or 30. All these, what it is if the other guy, if they're your counterparty, has a desire to net save in your currency, he's got to earn that currency by giving you real goods and services. And just that simple act per se is a real benefit to you and a real cost to him. The work
and a real cost to you as well, because if you're then running a permanent deficit on that basis, you then have to have a current account, capital account surplus, which means you're selling your assets over time.
Okay, but that's
the situation. That's the Australian economy. That's where I come from. We've had 50 years of running a current account deficit, mainly with a capital account surplus, meaning therefore we don't have any. Well, you have some domestic capitalists these days, but a large part of the capital income of Australia goes to America and the rest of the world, Japan, China, you name it, because we don't own the assets anymore.
Okay, so
number one,
that is
a major cost to a country over time. And that's not taken into account by that argument.
Those are number one, they're nominal costs, and what at the end of the day, what your standard of living is based on is your real terms of trade. And you're telling me about the nominal costs, which I agree with that. I'm not disagreeing with that. There are nominal costs.
It's not nominal cost. It's ownership of your assets.
That's nominal.
No, it's not nothing nominal about owning assets. It's that if 70% of your country is owned by another country, then 70% of your profit flow is going to be going overseas rather than staying domestically to get reinvested.
Yeah, but why does that matter? Why does that matter if they're not spending the money?
I don't even follow the question.
Okay, so if you've got capital, let's say Australia is paying $77 billion of Australian dollars in rent to Germany or China, and they don't spend any of it. They just pile it up as reserves. Then Australia doesn't have to export anything to them, and there's no real cost to Australia. It's just a nominal cost.
The cost is 70% of its profits go overseas and don't remain behind for domestic investment. So your economy grows more slowly. Less rapidly.
No, domestic investment is not constrained by that. That's not a constraint on domestic investment.
I totally disagree.
Well, loans create deposits. The government can net spend. There's no constraint on available funding.
If you're having, the loans create deposits are creating asset bubbles in the real estate sectors rather than creating actual investment. The government's is running a small deficit trying to control it, which of course we both know is totally wrong. But the firms themselves have there's very little investment funds being held domestically. You are not investing domestically and growing in domestic capabilities. And like Australia just shut down its car industry completely recently, and it's a huge part. It's just not investing, and it's because it's running a trade deficit over time.
Yeah, I agree that policy response can turn a good thing into a bad thing, and that's what Australia's done. They've turned a good thing, a trade deficit, into a bad thing with their policy response of tight fiscal and the whole thing.
On this particular point, I'm going to go to another authority called John Maynard.
Okay.
And one thing he was also very strong about was the need to restrain the growth of large trade deficits. He wanted to have pressure on surplus countries to spend. He wanted to have deficit countries required to devalue, et cetera. Frankly, I think in this particular case, I'm backing John Maynard and opposing MMT.
Yeah,
I don't think I should be able to say that. I don't think I should be able to say that.
I would say that's entirely applicable to fixed exchange rate policy, where the imperative is to sustain, your reserves and your exchange rate. But without that, with the floating exchange rate, it's not applicable.
Now, the floating exchange rate was supposed to get rid of current account deficits. You remember the neoclassical ideology?
No. It gets rid of the constraint. It doesn't get rid of the deficit. It turns
people believe. People believe. I'm talking your belief, not talking your belief here, Warren. But the Milton Friedmans of the world and so on, who are arguing for floating exchange rates as well, argue that would mean price mechanism would solve the deficits. Would have the exchange rates would adjust, and that every country would reach a trade balance. That's totally mythological. Okay, we've now seen Japan maintaining 40 or 50 years of trade surpluses. A country like Australia maintaining trade deficits. I would happily compare the industrialization of Japan to the industrialization of Australia, and the point I'm making here.
Yeah, I agree that Friedman was wrong. What can I tell you? But that's a different point from what I'm making.
Well, again, I think that's one point where MMT has got it wrong.
What part do I have wrong?
The part of it wrong is that if you're running a current account deficit, you must have a capital account surplus.
Right. No, I say that.
We know that.
Wait a minute. One at a time. So I have that right because I understand that identity.
Okay. Now what I'm saying is that capital account surplus means over time the ownership of your assets, your productive assets, is going from domestic hands to foreign hands.
Not necessarily. That's not necessarily equity. They can buy equity anyway, whether you have a current account surplus or deficit.
Yeah, but it means you're required to sell the equity or required to sell debt.
All right. In the first instance, no, you're not required to. You're spending the money first and then buying. Look, in the first instance, they're holding treasury securities, right? There's 3 or 4 trillion of U.S. treasury securities out there. There's no equity. And the same with Australia. They're holding Australian government bonds and, Indian and the whole thing. Now, if people want to buy equity or not, that's fine. But generally, states don't buy equity. Swiss National Bank's different, but most states don't buy equity.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is
they're not buying your capital. There's no capital. There's no real capital.
What they're buying is your companies.
The states are not buying your company.
No. But if American corporations are buying Australian companies.
Right. And we're running a trade deficit, a current account deficit, and we're buying your companies. I'm just saying it's not a constraint.
It's a constraint for us because we get less investment funds back in this country.
We're not. If Australia is running a trade deficit, but you have Australians buying companies all over the world, having a trade deficit doesn't constrain your corporations from buying corporations.
It doesn't stop some of them doing it, but in the aggregate, the overall effect is you're selling your domestically owned assets to foreign nationals who are not investing.
Financial assets.
Which means they've got ownership of the real ones. Financial assets.
No. It's not equity. It's mostly debt. But it could be equity. I'm not saying it couldn't be.
A huge part of it is foreign equity. There's a huge number of Australian companies which are 100% foreign owned.
Yeah.
General Motors was one of them until it's closed down. Okay.
Right. That's important for 2 reasons. Number one, control. You might not want foreigners controlling things. Okay. But apart from that, it's only important because they could get the profits and then spend them in your country, driving exports, which are real costs. The way you pay back importing for a lot of years is to export for a lot of years, worst case, if that happens. But when that time comes, there's a lot of domestic policies you could do, so it won't ever happen. You've got people sending you real goods and services in exchange for credit balances at your central bank, and there's no guarantee or no promise or nothing that says those credit balances are ever going to be able to buy things they can take home.
They're sending it in return for financial claims on your assets. Okay, we're talking financial transactions.
Well, they're buying Australian dollars and they're buying Australian government bonds. It's not a claim on.
And they're buying Australian companies.
Fine, but they can do that anyway. That has nothing to do with the trade.
I think it has a major factor why if you're running a deficit, you're in that situation. But there aren't many Japanese companies owned by American corporations or any other country in the world for that matter. The country that run a trade surplus and that they've had a current account, they can actually invest in the rest of the world in the aggregate. And they are not the ones whose domestic assets are owned by foreigners.
Sure. Look at all the foreign assets Australians own. In the UK, they own. In the United States.
Negative, massively negative. You can point to individual instances. That's like, anecdotes versus statistics. But in the aggregate level, we have lost a large amount of our ownership of our domestic assets, and a large part of our profit flow goes overseas.
Yeah. And what's okay?
I'm talking about Christian Riley's comment here.
What's the real cost of that? If it's not,
you have less investment. You have less investment.
No, the real cost would be
investment.
The real cost would be your real terms of trade. That's the only, look, the whole point of economics is consumption, right? There's no point in building anything or doing anything if you're not going to consume it. It's just a waste of time. Unless it's artwork, well, you consume that. It's just a waste of time. So you look at real terms.
It's also about developing capabilities over time.
About what?
It's not just developing capabilities over time, which takes investment.
Okay, but
improving the technology over time.
To what further purpose except consumption? You're just talking about long-term consumption versus short-term consumption.
I'm talking about having the capacity of a particular country to produce on a broad scale. And if you are running trade deficits, as Australia is doing, we are running out of the capacity to produce on a broad scale. Now, a country that has that, trade surpluses, has its own manufacturing sector, owns its own industries, that country grows more sufficiently.
All right. So what happens when you run out of assets? What's that day of reckoning look like? Now, I'm not saying you are, but let's say you do.
That's a long way in the future. But what it means is you have basically you have countries consisting only of workers, all the capitalists are foreigners. Let's say you
sold the opera house to China. What are they going to do? Dig it up and take it home? I mean, the same people are going to go see it. Are they going to have to pay more for a ticket? Like the guys there now, could have charged.
I think the income distribution in the country and the income levels in the country would fall compared to what it would be if you actually risk exporting. We don't have.
Why would it fall?
What you're saying you have a country consisting entirely of workers and no capitalists. That to me is a poor country.
Not necessarily. I mean, it could be. I'm not saying it. What?
I'm sorry. This is the right room for an argument on this particular point. Maybe we should move on to the next topic.
All right. But I'm just saying, first order per se, exports are real costs that you pay. It's your work, and somebody else gets the fruits of your labor. And imports are real benefits. And yes, there's a nominal payment. A dollar balance transfers from a domestic account to a foreign. It stays as a domestic asset, but it transfers from a domestic owner to a foreign owner.
What you're saying is Japan's followed a very foolish strategy for the last 50 years.
They what?
Until 99. It's effectively saying Japan's followed a very foolish strategy for the last 30 or 40 years, and so is Korea, and so is Germany.
I'm sorry, that's it. Yeah, to me it looks like to me it looks like what would happen if you were forced to do war reparations. You'd send the U.S. 2 million cars a year. You'd send Australia however many cars a year you get, and get nothing in return. That's called war reparations.
Well, if I look at Chicago versus Hiroshima, had you guess which country was bombed in the Second World War? I'd say it was America.
Yeah, because of our domestic policy. Our deficit's too small. We're not making the domestic investments. We have unused capacity.
I think you're also running far too large a trade deficit because you made the mistake of being the reserve currency rather than the bank or being created in the first place. And that failure to.
You don't think the U.S. could rebuild all its infrastructure independent of trade?
No, I don't think it certainly could, but it's not doing it.
Right. Well, that's a total failure of policy and recognizing that, everything else about MMT, right? That's got nothing to do with trade.
I think it's got a lot to do with trade, and trade is part of MMT, and I don't believe you integrate it properly, and we're not going to reduce either of us on that particular point, so let's move on to one of the others.
Can I jump in here just for a second? You guys are going toe to toe here, and it's extremely important discussion. I think there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of questions, but the one question I have, and it's really confusing to me because obviously I look at Europe largely as the United States, like Florida and Chicago and New York and California, whatever. You're talking about Germany, which is not monetarily sovereign. They've given up their sovereignty to the ECB. They are now part of a state system like the United States has.
Yeah.
And we're talking about it feels like two entirely different scenarios. So I'm having a real difficult time wrapping my head around that. Germany can't produce euros just because they have to go and literally borrow from an extra non-governmental situation that has nothing to do with their country now. Whereas the United States does have its own national bank, just like the UK, Australia, China, Russia, and Japan, obviously. So what I'm hearing is, it sounds to me like if Texas is a net importer or a net exporter versus whether Florida is a net importer or a net exporter, I'm seeing this in different terms. Can you please show me where I'm right or wrong in this? Because I'm not. I see Europe as a very different scenario than I do the UK or Canada.
I think that's fair enough. We're just using Europe because that's where I am based at the moment. But you're better off making an analogy between, say, Japan and Australia, and leaving out America, which is the reserve currency producer, or the European Union, which has a single currency strangling the continent.
Well, Steve, you just use the European Union as a whole. It's running a 300 billion trade surplus.
Yeah,
it's running a huge trade surplus. And yes, most of it's Germany, but it's still a huge trade surplus.
Yeah, that's true.
Overall.
Yeah.
And if you look at consumption, it's down by the trade surplus. That had been domestic output. If they just kept it for themselves, they'd be that much better off. But of course, they can't do it within their fiscal constraints. So
let me ask you this.
You're right, Steve, you're correct. But look, exports are costs and imports are benefits for any agent, for your family. Things you have to send out as a cost, things you get in as a benefit. Your work is your cost.
Well, maybe in a particular point, I normally criticize a lot of American thought as being rather puritanical in basis, but I sort of have a puritanical side here as well, in saying you need the discipline of working. And I don't like the idea of saying I sit back on my ass and hand out pieces of paper and get commodities back for them. I think I should be working for them to some degree. And that working makes me stronger.
Nonetheless, economics is the opposite of religion. It's better to receive than to give, right?
All right. So let me jump in here one more time. So we have a bunch of great conversation there, but there's a couple points though that I think are really key. And one of them that I've seen debated around, and full disclosure, so there's no concern. Obviously, I'm very, very much an advocate for the federal job guarantee and for job guarantee programs in general from sovereign states. I understand that there's some concern and some discussion about the United States in particular, but other countries as a whole, that government creates unemployment. And we're saying the dollar, MMT would say the dollar is merely a tax credit, and that the imposition of a tax creates the first unemployed person. And therefore, you have to work to get that dollar. So as a public option, there should be a job waiting for you so that we keep the production high and we peg the economy to labor. The flip side is this UBI. Go ahead.
Almost, but go ahead.
Well, I'm just Steve Dude. I'm the activist, not the economist.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, the UBI, on the other hand, is something that I've seen folks like Roger Malcolm Mitchell, and I've seen Professor Keen and others be more sympathetic towards. What I'm trying to understand is the real relationship between UBI versus job guarantee, why one is superior of the other, whether they can be combined, and more importantly, if in fact government is responsible for unemployment. Go.
Okay. So you had started when I interrupted you, so you want to just go ahead?
Me? Oh, okay. Well, look, I'll let you start on the job guarantee, Warren. It's more your thing, okay. And I'll come with my nuances on it.
All right. So for me, the money story always starts with a government that wants to provision itself. And historically, there are different ways to do this. You could go win a war and bring back slaves or something like that. Or you could hit drunks on the head with a beer bottle and they wake up in the British Navy. There's different ways to provision government. But for the main part, we use a monetary system. And so let's look at that, clean sheet of paper. How do we do that? How does the government provision itself? And the example I like to use is when the British went into Ghana in the early 1800s. This is a story I've read. Whether it's true or not actually doesn't matter because it makes a point anyway. But I believe it is true. They wanted to grow coffee. And there were the people who were already living there had no interest in growing coffee for the British. They were hunting and fishing and taking care of the kids, and their grandmothers were taking care. They didn't have any unemployment as we define it, people looking for paid work. So the British could offer them money to go grow coffee, but they didn't have any interest. It had no value to them in that society. So what the British did was they put a tax on their houses, their huts. They called it a hut tax. And it was in some script, call it the crown or something. And you either paid the tax, and maybe it's 10 crown a month per hut, or they would burn your house down. And now all of a sudden you've got the place got monetized. Now they're all looking for work down at the coffee plantation. How much do you pay? Oh, we pay 1 crown a day. And they would get 10 days labor out of each hut. And then when people who were, growing tomatoes wanted to sell them, they wanted crowns so they could pay their hut tax without getting their house burned down. And so somebody would go work extra days to get tomatoes because he doesn't like farming. And the whole economy immediately gets monetized. And then what we see is that so people there'd be a certain tax. If there are 100 huts and there was 10 crown each, the total tax would be 1,000. But at the end of the day, the British would spend more than 1,000 crown. Okay, number one, they had to spend first before they could collect tax, right? You spend first and then collect the tax because there's no other place to get it. So people would show up for work, and invariably more than enough would show up. So they might get 1,100 days labor, and they'd spend 1,100 and only collect 1,000, and the other 10 would be the other 100 would be savings, currency in circulation, the money supply of the village. And okay, so the question is, what would happen if they taxed 1,000, and they only wanted maybe 1,100 days work, but there were 1,500 people showed up for work because there was a huge desire to save these things. Okay, now you have unemployment, all right? And let me just back up a second. As soon as they put the tax on everybody's hut, a place that never had any unemployment now had mass unemployment because suddenly everybody was looking for paid work to earn the crown so they didn't get their house burned down. After the British employed as many as they wanted, if they didn't take everybody who wanted the paid work, they had residual unemployment, which meant the desire to save was that much higher. And then the British had two choices. They could either lower the tax or hire the rest of the people. Okay, and so we're in much the same position today. The tax structure of the U.S. economy produces maybe 15 million unemployed. Maybe the government hires 10 million. I don't know the exact numbers. I mean, hires 5 million. And then we have 10 million residual unemployed. It means the tax was too powerful. It created a huge savings desire. Of course, we also put laws in place so you get all these pre-tax savings plans, tax deductions for your IRAs and your KIOs and your pension fund and your medical expense, all kinds of things. So we put in these powerful incentives to not spend income, and it all grows tax-free. All that income's unspent. And so a relatively small tax produces a whole lot of unemployed that the government doesn't want to hire. And so the obvious response is to either hire them, increase public spending, or lower the tax and let them go back into the private sector. The problem is, once they're unemployed, they become damaged goods. Not personally, but in that the private sector doesn't like to hire people who haven't been working. So what we do is we provide a transition job, a job guarantee that says anybody willing and able to work can have a job for it. The number doesn't matter economically. It's going to be a numeraire anyway, but so I'll pick a number of $10 an hour, and I know that I get arguments over that, but it doesn't. I can also show how it doesn't matter long term, and it can be changed the next day if it's a bad thing. It's not 1,000-year wage or anything. So before everybody gets too upset and says it should be 15 or what. Okay, you pay $10 an hour, and for anybody who wants a job. Now, those people who take that job will then presumably be able to transition more easily back into the private sector with sufficient fiscal adjustment, lower taxes or more public spending, than they would have been if they were unemployed. And all the statistics show that, and the Fed New York just came out with a study showing exactly that employers prefer to hire the employed and not the unemployed. And so to me, the primary purpose is to undo what the government did, which was overtax for the number of people it wanted. And maybe you have to do that to get the quality you want. And then you have to transition people back. And maybe some of these people will never transition back. I understand that. But it's part of the program. And then if you look at currencies, every currency, the price level of every currency is ultimately controlled by some kind of buffer stock policy. Right now, of course, we use an unemployed buffer stock, which is not particularly effective. The hysteresis is showing each time takes more and more unemployment to, the Nehru or whatever you want to call it. Not that there is a Nehru, but the mythical Nehru keeps going up and up, right? Because the private sector doesn't like to hire the unemployed. They become damaged goods. Now, once you're in a transition job, then it's just a much more, the population becomes a much more liquid buffer stock. The employed are much more liquid in terms of being hireable, being employable than the unemployed. And so it becomes a superior price anchor to using unemployment. And they certainly aren't less liquid. So it's in all likelihood, they're more liquid, they're certainly not less liquid. So what we have is a form of full employment, and we have a superior price anchor. And that's the nature of it. Now, I know there's a lot of people who have all these grand ideas for what these people should do. And that's fine. But for me, that they should be hired as regular public sector employees. If you think you want people out doing green jobs and doing these things for the public sector, don't use the JG to do that. Just hire them. Okay. Or if they're in the JG for a while and now you've decided they're doing useful things by being crossing guards for children, hire them as public sector workers. Okay. And so I don't know if that difference makes me more or less progressive. I think it makes me more progressive. I'm not sure, but that's my personal opinion on that. And sorry to talk so long on this.
That's okay. So, Professor Keen, your turn here, sir.
Well, actually, on the job guarantee, I'm not a critic of the job guarantee. My perspective, we'll talk about what causes unemployment at a later point. But in terms of the role of things like a job guarantee versus universal basic income, I have, first of all, a support for the idea of a job guarantee for the reasons that Warren's outlined. I have two concerns about it as the only policy. I know a lot of people say job guarantee versus UBI. I don't see why it has to be versus. I think you could potentially have a UBI at a lower level than an out-of-date that gave you a job guarantee, which is at a lower level that gave you a private sector or a public sector job. And you could, it wouldn't be a...
Steve, I completely agree. I completely agree.
Great. Yeah, that's great, Mac, to hear that.
And now I might have a different reason, but I agree.
Yeah. And there's a few things about it. I mean, for the job guarantee, a good mate of mine, David Graeber, is coming out with a book. I think I'm actually already published, called Bullshit Jobs. And if you look at the type of jobs a lot of people are doing, even the more modern economy, even very, very close to full employment, a lot of people are doing it just bullshit and they know it. And this is partly because over time, our technological level has risen so much, the number of people we need to actually be doing physical production of physical goods and services is trivial. It's down to something of the order of between, depending on the economy, 10 and 20% of the population having any real direct role in manufacturing. And as time goes on,
Steve, the people worried about the robots, they're already here for 90%. We're just talking about tag ends now. Yeah.
That's right.
They're confusing a productivity story with an unemployment story.
Yeah, I think that's true. But the other thing about as time goes on, this now I want to have workers versus capitalist story here, because my argument, the reason why workers get paid a wage is because they can say to a capitalist, unless you pay me enough to live, I'm not going to flick that switch. You've got to flick it yourself. Okay. These days, workers do not get a job because they're productive. They get a job because they're required to turn the machines on. Now, if you get to the point where the machines can turn the machines on, then that particular capacity for workers, which is the vast majority of the population, to blackmail the capitalists to give them a share of the surplus the system is generating, disappears. And I think politically we have to get to the point where the mass of the population is organised not through its capacity to bargain over having a job and those jobs being necessary for capitalists to make a profit, but I want them to be able to get it as because they're part of the polis of the society. And therefore that society provides a basic living for everybody, which would be the universal basic income. If you want to work, then you want to try to get a much larger income, then you can do that. And you can also be an entrepreneur, which is something I'm massively in favor of, genuine entrepreneurs, not our property market mob. But ultimately, as technology gets more and more advanced, more and more work is done by machines, less and less need for labor, we're going to need to change that power structure. And getting a UBI now, I think, is part of doing that. I understand a lot of American resistance to that is because a lot of the people are pushing UBI want to basically use it to eliminate all of the forms of welfare and actually reduce the amount the state is paying. And of course, I don't support that. I want to see UBI being a decent basic income, decent living standard.
Okay, so let's go back to Ghana where you charge $10, a 10 crown, a month rent. Then you say, you know what, we'll give you a universal basic income of 10 crown.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's going to show up for work. The government can't provision itself. It can't grow coffee.
My point is that you're getting that you're taking me back to the 19th century. Let's take us forward to the 22nd. If we improve our technology over time, there'll be no need, virtually no need for labour whatsoever. We've already both agreed that about 90% of workers aren't involved in production at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, it's going to be 99% at some stage. Now,
right, and I think that's a small jump. I think the bulk of it's already happened.
Yeah, it's further to go, and I think ultimately, for the sake of the planet, we've got to protect. This is going to make it like a space cadet, and I'm happy to do that this time of night in Amsterdam. We're going to need to take production off planet to repair the damage we've done to the ecology of this planet at some point.
Yeah.
And when we do that, you certainly can't talk about putting any percentage of the population in space. It is going to be a case where the owners of the machinery are the ones who are going to get the benefits, unless we impose some social control that means the massive population receives a living income. And my fear is if we don't get this politically worked out ahead of schedule early enough, then we're going to face what I call the Hunger Games future, where the vast majority get bugger all, they're entertained, they're repressed, and a tiny elite lives extremely well on the wealth created by the machinery and the technology we've embedded. And I think we're within 50 to 100 years of that period hitting.
Yeah. Well, the job guarantee, the transition job, it's a wage set by the government, so it can be a real wage. It can set a minimum standard of living. And so if you direct a minimum number of real resources from the bottom up, then the top is fighting for they can have all the nominal wealth they want, but they're fighting for a limited amount of real wealth. And they can't outbid the state. There is no such thing. And so to me, that addresses that problem.
The trouble is they can own the state. This is the world we have in the future.
Which is my campaign finance reform, which is critical.
Yeah.
Which is you can give all the money you want, except 40% goes to the opposition.
Can I jump in momentarily? One of the things that I'm noticing, because as somebody who's on the learning side versus the teaching side, it jumps out at me that what we're really talking about a lot of times is placing more emphasis on these artificial rules, fiscal rules, and things like that prevent certain things as if they were spoken into existence from God from day one, and they exist in perpetuity. When in reality is we see things like the silly debt ceiling in the United States that is obviously a man-made construct that doesn't really serve any purpose other than to create another political hoop to jump through. I think that I'm seeing some different.
Oh, hey, we've lost our bloody commentator here.
How about that? I'm back.
Again?
I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, I'm good. I just had to plug my phone in. It's down to
we just lost Steve for a moment there. That was really critical.
That was strange.
The ref was out of the gym.
So, back to the question though. Why are we placing so much emphasis? And now Warren's gone. Why are we placing so? Here, let's bring him back. So,
I'm the only consistent people in Amsterdam. This must be something about the
it seems like we keep placing more emphasis on fiscal rules as if they're real constraints as opposed to artificial ones.
Yeah.
Then just understanding
Steve, that. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. We're all here. Can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Warren? Can you hear us?
Can you hear us? Okay. All right. Well, the point I'm making here is that
you there?
Warren, we're going to drop you off real quick, buddy. The idea here is that fiscal rules and monetary policy kind of get conflated sometimes, and what I'm seeing here is the need to serve the people. And I'm going to stay U.S. centric momentarily, just because it's a place of familiarity. I'm going to bring Warren back up. I think he's found his spot. Oh,
let's
see. Warren, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I didn't hear the last 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's right. Good. Yep.
So what I'm saying is, just to bring us all back to the point, there's a lot of emphasis on fiscal rules. There's an incredible amount of emphasis on these gold standard based, peg commodity based type rules, that really have no applicability in a non-peg, a fiat currency environment. And yet we live by them as if they're God spoken.
Yeah.
It seems like you guys agree on an awful lot, but there are some things that I'm feeling just in my plebe status that
Yeah.
maybe I'm picking up on some things that maybe are emphasizing fiscal rules over perhaps the real base of fiat currency. Keep me honest here. I don't want to overspeak my hand because I'm truly the moderator.
I think I've got an idea of what you're drifting at. This is why Warren and I think we're totally on the same page. And that is that people have an understanding of the role of money, similar to the understanding that Ptolemaic astronomers had of the solar system. And they say, look, it must be the case that the Earth is the center of the universe because, look, the sun and the moon and the planet all orbit us. And we're saying, no, it's not the case. It's actually the Earth is spinning as it rotates around the sun, and that makes the illusion of appearing the sun rises and sun sets. But you've really got that mental flip people have to go through to understand the actual role of money. Warren and I, the MMT crowd in general, and most post-Keynesians are on the other side of that Gestalt flip. But the majority of the population, and certainly the majority of politicians and journalists, are still on the Ptolemaic side of economics. And what I've been trying to do, and Warren, I'd like you to take a look at this, by the way, actually my Minsky software, I've been designing that to try to provide a framework where these people actually look at these flows with actual numbers on them. Hypothetical numbers, obviously, in the hypothetical model of the economy. But one thing I did there, and I've done this, would you believe the English government, I've got this, took out the English, a bunch of incompetent nongs. I wrote 2 submissions to 2 parliamentary inquiries, and they lost them both, and then said it must be my difficulty in uploading the fucking submissions, pardon the French. And I sent them my receipt of, thank you for sending your submission to us, documented. Yeah. But one thing I did with that is I did a little model of the economy, I thought the economy of Tom, Dick, Harry, Tom, Dick, and Harry, each with $100 in their account, each spending $100 per year on each other, and they then each decide to save money. And so Tom just spends $10 less on each of $5 less on each of Dick and Harry. And what happens is he saved $10 that year because he's spending $5 less on each of the other 2. But the other 2 have -5 in savings because the whole thing balances out to 0. And GDP falls by precisely the amount of money that's saved. Yeah. And try to make this case that if you try to save money, what you're actually doing is reducing GDP by precisely the amount you're saving. Yeah. And the whole idea of saving has to be driven out of people's thinking. But what they think is they're saving for a rainy day, or they're saving acorns, or you know, as my good friend Michael Kumok puts it, they're saving gravel to use at a later stage. So I'd like you to look at that Minsky software and have a play with it, because this is a major way of providing a way that we can actually get their heads around this, which means they can say, oh, it's actually, you're right, the sun is actually, it's staying still, it's sort of, in fact, we're spinning. Okay. Yeah. Right, yeah, paradox of thrift, right? Effectively, yeah, and I can actually demonstrate it mathematically and say, okay, you try to save money here and see what happens. Oh dear, the GDP fell. And it does make that point very, very visually and very effectively. I just look at the extreme. What if everybody spent nothing? Yeah, bang, GDP is 0. No sales, no jobs, no income, no savings. Yeah, yeah, fantastic. We're saved a fortune, we're all dead. Yeah. That was first put forth in the late 1500s. So it's not even a new theory. No, I know. Yeah, I didn't know it was that far back. But yeah, we need to get that understanding forward, and the only way to really do it, I think, is that's a dynamic vision of an economy. And that's why I built Minsky as a dynamic modeling tool, so you can actually say, here, play with this, do what you think is a good idea, and see what happens. Yeah. And the result is the opposite of what you expect. Yeah. And then you say, with this actually seems to the saving stuff, which is part of MMT lingo, and I'd like to suggest we move away from it, because I think it's actually destructively heard by other people who think in terms of savings in the old-fashioned acorn fashion. But we talk about the net desire to acquire net financial assets. Yeah. So let me just quickly come back to the universal basic income. So what I started before, the example is that it threatens the government's ability to provision itself. The government needs. Before you go too far, Stephanie's popped in saying, have Warren explain how it's structured e-buy alongside job guarantee. You can even know that one, Steve. That's a good point. Hi, Stephanie. So look, the problem is, if everybody gets the money they need to pay taxes for free, then there's nobody left to work for the government. The government can't spend its tax credit if there's no net tax out there. And so I'm not saying you'll get there immediately or anything, but that's a risk. And that's a pretty serious risk, because the whole point is the monetary system is, in the first instance, for the government to provision itself. And so on the other hand, our tax structure is so skewed against the average person. It's so regressive that the basic income
moves in the right direction to undo some of that regressiveness.
Yeah,
and so
I think that's true.
So you can do it to some degree. You might not be able to go to a full living wage without threatening provision, but you can certainly go to enough to undo a lot of the damage of our regressive tax system, or you can directly change the regressive tax system and sort of get to the same place. So that's the way I'm looking at it. So from a practical point of view, the tax structure is so impossible to touch that it makes the basic income makes up for a lot of wrongs.
I actually see feeling sympathy pains for the broken arm Stephanie out there. Just said, you must tell us how you, well, don't tell us how you did it until it's a parlor joke, Stephanie, because I saw the tweet about your breaking arm and a great deal of sympathy for that situation. Yeah. Steve, well, have we completely lost the conversation here, or what have we done?
I think I'm still here.
You guys are still here. You guys, if I just mute myself to minimize the feedback.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So we are over time, but one thing I wanted to ask to close out, is it fair to say that both of you believe in robust domestic spending to serve the people? Is that a fair statement that both economists here would support robust spending on the economy and for the people?
Yeah. What we need to do is to communicate that effectively to the public that think that's a bad thing. And the difficulty there is saying you have to really look at the flows and explain the flows and the accumulation of stocks in the system, and show that if you try to do what people think is a good idea, you're actually taking money out of circulation and telling the economy to grow at a nominal sense at the same time. And it's that realization, it's exactly the same gestalt that people have to make from seeing the world in a Ptolemaic way to seeing it in a Copernican way. And, I think my hat off to the MMT in general for making a lot of this start to week through, but we've still got a long, long way to go.
Okay, Steve, so I'll give you the micro and the macro. At the macro, we probably need it for now anyway to get to anywhere. If we ran a $2 trillion deficit instead of a $1 trillion, we'd probably be, the gains in output would probably be 5 to 6% a year for a couple of years till we got to something closer to full utilization of capacity. But it can all be done in the wrong way. It can all be done and turn into adding to our energy consumption of things we don't want to burn. It can be done by increasing the military that we don't want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, there are all kinds of wrong ways to do that. So it's not just spending per se. And also we've got some massively regressive taxation like the FICA taxes, which just punishing tax on people doing the real work, making under $100,000 a year from zero on up, who without them, we'd have nothing. Everything you do, everything you have, every service you engage in is, they're supporting it, and they're the most heavily taxed. So that, and all because they don't count FICA they don't count the FICA tax as a tax. They say, oh, it's an investment. It's not an investment, it's a tax. All right, so we've got regressive taxation to deal with. We've got our infrastructure needs probably $1 trillion a year for 10 years or something, because we have it could be that much better, not because we're just throwing money at it, but we don't have the interface between government and the population is so bad that the population doesn't think the government can do anything right. We've got to address the interface between government and population, start off by giving everybody in government some kind of hospitality training, and then listen to what the public, administration graduates tell you about nepotism and supervisory positions and how it undermines your departments, and get it right. If we can't get that right, the government's going to have to be in a position to write the checks for these things, but it can't do it. And then our contracting structure is horrible also.
My concluding remark is that I think we've got to give the financial sector the role of the demon rather than the government. And the great trouble of the Austrian perspective on the economy and mainstream economy as well, they make the workers or the government out to be the problem. I think the real problem in capitalism has one is the financial sector. And its excessive claims upon the real economy, and its generation of parasitic claims and speculation driving up asset prices rather than creating new assets. So that's the enemy we need to focus upon.
Right. So the financial sector is 30% of S&P profits or something. When I was in the financial sector in 1973, we had 2.6. I was at a savings bank. We just had deposits and mortgages, and we financed just the little savings banks around the country financed 2.6 million housing starts with a 200 million population. Okay, 2.6 million. Today, with 340 million people, We've got 1.2 million housing starts, and it's an unsustainable bubble. The financial sector is a parasite. It's just killing
Absolutely.
it. Okay, and I've got ways to get rid of it. Number one, which has other benefits, of course, which is not private, but a permanent zero rate policy eliminates all the bond trading. Bonds just stay at zero. You don't let the Treasury issue anything longer than a 3-month bill, and that's fine. It's deflationary. It's not an inflationary policy or anything else, and it gets rid of a big chunk of the financial sector that's adding to the income distribution issues that we're facing. The other thing is no insured pension fund should be able to buy stocks. That's if you're right, you win, and if you're wrong, the government pays. It makes no sense. If you're an insured pension fund, you stay out of the equity markets. That eliminates, 2/3 of the volume, gets rid of a large chunk of that sector, right? And I've got 3 or 4 other ways to dramatically reduce the the banking. Banks should
is a modern debt.
Yeah, narrow
modern
banking.
debt really.
Yeah, banks should only be allowed to do. You tell the banks what they can do, not what they can't do. Okay, and then that eliminates a whole lot of problems with the banks. And they should only be lending on credit analysis, not mark to market, and
not on collateral lending either. Yeah.
Yeah, right, for public purpose. And so the regulators have to determine whether any class of lending is not whether it's going to be profitable from the banks, but whether it suits public purpose. Otherwise, let the private sector do it. And so that can be dramatically reined in without dispute, without having it, and go a lot to what I call shrinking the financial sector, Steve, what you're talking about. And I've got 3 or 4 more.
Modern debt jubilee to reduce the level of private debt and to increase the ownership of equities by the non-speculating public.
Yeah, I think financial assets should not qualify as collateral for banks. There's no public purpose there. You should, where's the public purpose behind leveraging stocks or bonds? There isn't any. So why would you look, banks are agents of the state. They're not private sector any more than the military is. They're state chartered. Their deposits are insured, so it's all public money. The regulators can dismiss management. They control asset quality. They control what the banks can do. It's like the military. Yeah, they let the soldier aim his gun left or right within a range, but it's still a public entity. Yes, the loan officer can price risk, but that's all he can do. And he's a public sector servant. And when you're in banking and you own a bank, you're a public sector entity, just like the military. And with not a whole lot more freedom.
You get a public sector wage as well.
Yeah, okay. And so, and that's another issue, right? The whole corporate governance. Once you've got the government grants corporations limited liability, that gives them enormous, justification, power, whatever you want to call it, to make sure they're serving public purpose. Otherwise, they can do it without limited liability. Let them be personal liable if they're not serving public purpose. So again, once you're a government, the whole reason government's there is public infrastructure for public purpose. And then it's about defining what constitutes public infrastructure and making sure it's for public purpose. And the whole legal structure is public infrastructure, including limited liability for corporations. And that comes with it the responsibility of making sure it serves public purpose. So anyway, I can talk for hours on this, and I won't.
You guys, to be fair, we are 15 minutes over time. I don't normally do that, but I do have a request. I have one more question.
Do I have to put another quarter in?
What's that?
Do I have to put another quarter in?
No. I think you'll be all right. but this is a question that I think is it's more functional. And the question is this: for many, many years, the United States and other countries have not invested in their once built infrastructure. Yeah. Any other asset that you have on the books, it depreciates, it comes off, and it gets to zero. In the United States, we've got buildings, we've got pipes made of wood, we've got pipes made of clay, we've got pipes made of lead, we've got paper wrapped wires in our phone lines. We have not spent the money necessary to keep up. And if you think about it, any other thing, your car every day, you've got to put oil, you got to change your oil, you've got to change your spark plugs, you got to rotate your tires, you got to do all this stuff. We have not done that.
Steve, hey, can you
right here to me?
Can you repeat that, Steve? I'm writing those things down for my car. Could you repeat them, please?
But the idea here is that general maintenance to maintain the infrastructure that serves all of our needs. That, in my opinion, is a huge job program accidentally if we actually stuck to a real honest maintenance schedule that we would demand for our own lives. Why can't a government that has no means, an infinite means, if you will, why can a government not do that? Why are we sitting here with bridges and D-rated status? Point I'm making is that if we're spending on this, I would consider to be definitely public purpose.
Yeah.
This right here changes everything. If we actually kept up with all of our infrastructure across the nation, jobs aplenty, blue collar jobs, good jobs, regular people jobs, nice pay, not $10 an hour, but $30, $40 an hour, real serious work. What is it? Is it a mindset or what?
It's an ideology. You've got an ideology of the marketplace. The market does things better than the state, et cetera, et cetera. It's an obsession with efficiency, and not balanced by an unequal obsession with robustness. And the government gives you that robustness, and by letting the debate be dominated by efficiency, we've basically lost that debate. So I think we need to talk about the need for a robust society as well as an efficient one. If you leave it on the efficiency basis, the neoclassical, the Austrians are always going to appear to win that argument ideologically, even though in the practical terms, what they do is they destroy the efficiency of the society they're talking about.
Hey, Steve, the short answer is if you're asking that question, you must be new here.
That's a good note to finish on, I think.
I look at it like this, for the people watching, right, that don't understand how our government could make our economy fill the bathtub back up so that we're not in a false scarcity, that we could actually serve each other's needs, be able to take a day off without worrying about whether it's going to cost us our electric bill, et cetera. It seems like there's an awful lot of opportunity there. And I understand a lot of the nefarious reasons from the 70s and even before that created this lack of fiscal space. But I guess what I'm asking is for other people who aren't necessarily thinking about how spending fuels the economy and how it actually works. It seems to me like infrastructure, above all else, just maintaining it.
Hey, Steve, look,
the greatest job guarantee of all.
Let's look at somebody 40 years old, right? They've got maybe 30 years of memory, of economic memory. And the bar has been set so low for these people. They think this is normal. This is what they were born into. This is how life is. They think this is how we're, they don't see this as any kind of like a aberrant situation like you are. Now, for somebody who grew up in the 50s and 60s, who knows what a good economy is, where in your second or third year of college, you had corporations lined up trying to hire you when you get out. You had infrastructure all over or something like that. It's a whole different thing. This young generation, I'm telling you, we've set the bar so low that they can't even imagine what you're talking about.
That's true, unfortunately. People, you get saturated by the current situation and think that's always been the way.
Yeah, 20 years of this in Europe, and that's it. These people think that's normal life.
Yeah.
I'm happy. It's the way it always is.
All right, gentlemen. Well, look.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, both of you. Amazing, amazing people. I really am appreciative of this. Professor Keen, I really do hope we can have you back on sometime in the future. And
sure.
Warren, of course, thank you so much.
Anytime. Y'all keep fighting a good fight out there. All right.
Indeed, both sides. Okay, bye, guys.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much, everyone.